Jesus doesn't want to be a part of your life. Jesus wants to be your life. Jesus was once asked what the most important command was. His answer? To love the Lord with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. To seek Jesus with our attention, affections, desires, energy, and attitudes, from the most basic aspect of our personality to the deepest parts of who we are. Jesus wants every aspect, every area, and every angle.
Well, good morning. Good to be together. We doing well? This winter, Ohio's just like, let's do it all at the same time. Let's do the flu, let's do the snow, do a little rain, a little snow, a little rain, whole thing. It's wonderful. If you're new with us, special welcome to you. If I haven't met you before, my name's Aiden, one of the pastors. If you're downstairs or online, glad that you guys are with us as well. Coming out of high school, I was in a band, played in a band with some friends. You're like, oh, you guys in a band? Were you good? My mom liked us, and that's all that mattered. And we were in this band, and it was fun. It's like everything you dream of. We when we were graduating, that summer we went to a festival in Illinois. It was actually this festival put on by a commune of Christians. It was weird, but we went out there and played. And now at this festival, there was all kinds of like generator stages. So like all kinds of just like gas powered generators. So you would play, and behind you playing was just like a generator, right? So it was all these bands like playing all over the place on the ground, under a tent, all this stuff. And most of the bands were screaming bands. So it was a lot of yelling. And when we were a pop band, it was kind of our thing. And so we were like a little bubblegum island and just a sea of anger is kind of what the situation was. And so because we were out there and people were, you come and listen to so much screaming, you're like, well, let's go listen to this pop band. Are they good? Doesn't matter. We're just going to go because they're not yelling at us. And so we did decent. There'd be some people that would come and gather. We played like 5 shows in 4 days. But every time before we would play, I would start to not feel good. I was always like, I don't know, man. I don't know if I feel good. And one of the guys, my friend Eli in the band, he started he doesn't get visibly annoyed, but he got annoyed. And he's like, Aiden, come here. He's tired of me always feeling sick right before we play. He's like, come here. I'm going to give you a little something. Here's a little pill. You can take this. Now, I've been telling the story all day, and I didn't really think about it when it was on my notes, but it sounds real sketchy saying it out loud. But he's like, come here, Aiden. I got a pill I want you to take. It'll make you feel better, right? It'll make you feel better. Because what he knew was that it wasn't my body that was making me feel weird. It was my mind, right? So what he gave me, which I didn't know, was he just gave me a multivitamin that he brought with himself so he could, take his multivitamins. He's like, take this, go on a little 10-minute walk. It'll make you feel better. So I took this pill, this magical mystery pill that was going to make me feel better, went on a walk, and I came back. I'm like, man, that really did it. I was like, is that ginger root? What is in there? I feel great. Let's do this show, man. When he just gave me a, whatever, men's health pill. But what was true was that the pill did nothing to help me because my problem was in my mind. That it wasn't what was in the pill, but it was the placebo effect that made my mind at ease and made me think that I felt better. The mind is one of the most powerful specimens in all of creation. You know this, right? The mind isn't just simply the organ of our brain, right? It's not what we're talking about. But the mind is the ability to direct our thoughts. It's with our minds that we solve problems, that we convince ourselves of what's real, that we form opinions, that we dream, that we create, and that we map the trajectory of our lives, right? To say that the mind is powerful would be an understatement, right? I can put thoughts in your mind right now, right? Don't picture Dan in a pink bunny suit. Don't do it. And you did it. You did it right now, right? The mind can create all kinds of stuff, right? We're in this series called Every Angle. And oftentimes what happens is when we come at life, what we're doing through this series is looking at what it means to love Jesus with every part of us. But oftentimes when we come to life, what it seems like is, especially in church world, it feels like there's a drawer where kind of spiritual stuff goes. So in that drawer goes prayer and the Bible and eternity stuff, and that goes in the spiritual drawer. But then there's our life drawer. And in there, that goes bills and relationships and routines and hobbies and favorite foods and favorite pastimes, relational drama, medical procedures, to-do lists, and the like. It all goes in that drawer, right? But I love what John Ortberg says. I read this week. He says this: God is not interested in what you call your spiritual life. He is interested in your life, right? He's interested in your life. Jesus was asked, what is the most important commandment of all the law, of all the Old Testament? What is the most important thing to follow? And what Jesus said in Mark 12 is this. He says, love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, with all of your mind, and with all of your strength. There's not two different drawers, but all of this, heart, soul, mind, and strength, goes into the life drawer. And Jesus wants all of it because all of it was designed for him. And so today what we want to look at is how we might love Jesus with one of the most powerful aspects of who we are. That's the mind. So today, what are we talking about when we talk about the mind? The Greek word for this is nous, and it refers to all the areas of our intellect and of our understanding, right? No surprises there. But what's interesting, that's the New Testament word. The Old Testament word for when we talk about the mind is the Hebrew equivalent oftentimes gets translated as heart when we talk about the mind, because both words, both heart and mind, are so closely tied to who we are, our personality, our emotion, and our being, right? So what I want to do, what we kind of did last week, is I want to throw a picture up here in a second, and this picture is just a couple different areas of what we talk about when we talk about the mind. Now, we can't do this exhaustive, or we'll be here for like 47 years, right? Because there's so much to the mind. But what I want to do today is put this picture up, look at a couple different areas of what we talk about when we talk about the mind, and then take a look at what does it mean to love Jesus with all of that. All right, you with me? It's been a long week. Are you with me? I need your sauce this morning. That's the spirit. That's what I like. All right, up here, and I've said this all the services. I just need to say it again. I might have said this last week. I know my handwriting's terrible. But I need you guys to know, I rewrote each one of those words, this is no lie, 10 times. And I wrote back and I tried to write it slow. I tried to write it fast. I tried to use the lines. And I'm just going to stick to typing next. I probably should have just typed it anyways. I don't know why. Anyways, first word we're looking at is knowledge. Now, knowledge, you probably, when you think of the mind, this is maybe one of the first things that you think of, right? Or knowledge or information or understanding or insight, right? The facts and figures that we fill our mind with, right? Our knowledge. I, about 9 years ago, watched a Cavs and Warriors game. Never cared about sports at all in my entire life. But all of a sudden became real intrigued and got really into basketball. And I started to grow in my knowledge of basketball, right? Much of it thanks to Pastor Adam and his discipleship in the ways of sports. But I started to grow in knowledge of the game, understand the game, how it was played, what were the rules, what bird rights were, all these things, right? I was growing in knowledge. Again, that's information, understanding, or insight. As kids, knowledge lets us know which parent to ask a given question to, right? Knowledge helps keep us from making the same mistake twice. Knowledge helps us to make sense of the people, situations, and circumstances around us. Knowledge is how we first start to make sense of the story of Jesus, right? We hear the stories. We hear the theologies. We hear how it works together. It's knowledge that begins to stir the wheel, right? That we oftentimes say this around here, we pursue understanding in order to apply wisdom, right? The more information, the more background we have on something, we can apply wisdom to that situation, right? The second thing is this. You think about the mind, we think about our attention. We think about our attention, something that we might not always think about, right? But when I started to pay attention to sports, when I started to learn and grow my knowledge of sports, I started to pay attention to all kinds of things. I started listening to sports radio, watching Stephen A. Smith on YouTube, started paying attention to trades, had the Bleacher Report app, talking to Adam about the trade deadline. Like I began paying attention to all these aspects of basketball that I previously wasn't paying attention to. Now, attention is an interesting thing. Have you ever heard the term attention economy? Have you ever heard that term? Basically, it's this, that there are all kinds of businesses and apps and social media things that make money off of your attention, right? If they can keep your focus and your eyeballs on their stuff, you make money. If you're not paying for a commodity, your attention is probably the commodity, right? Something that we don't always think about. But algorithms, social, you know how you like things and it makes you feel a certain way, so you pay attention to it more. Someone retweets you pay attention to it more. You drag down at the top of Facebook and it resets everything. It makes it all new. You drag down YouTube, it resets. It's all new. You're like, oh, a whole new YouTube feed. Wow, they got my attention for another 20 minutes, right? It's all designed that way to keep your attention, right? Because your attention is of utmost importance, right? We must pay attention to what we are paying attention to. Because we'll look at this in a little bit. As goes our attention, so goes our life. There's a book that it's really formative. I love it. It's called The Attentive Life by Leighton Ford. And he says this: paying attention is not a way by which we make something happen, but a way to see what is already given to us. What he's saying is you can't create something when you pay attention to it. It's already there. That paying attention is a way to see what is already before us, right? That attention is of utmost importance. Think about this third one. Think about our imagination. Our imagination. Now, before you think I'm going to go reading Rainbow on you, just walk with me for a second. Because what would happen is I started growing a knowledge of basketball. I started paying attention to all these different basketball things. But I started to daydream and imagine, what if I was on the Cavs? What if LeBron stayed? What if JR didn't mess up that shot in 2018? We took game 1 against the Warriors. Maybe we could have won that series, and maybe LeBron could have taken 2 chips in Cleveland, and maybe he would have stayed. Maybe I was the only one imagining all these things, right? But you think about imagination, and when I say imagination, you may be thinking about your kids. But stick with me, because the truth is we all exercise our imaginations every single day. When someone wrongs you, when someone frustrates you, that revenge fantasy that kind of floats in your mind, that, what I'm probably going to say to them, what I should have said to them, and if they ever say that again, that's all your imagination. That's all you kind of creating a reality, imagining how you're going to respond in your head, right? How you're hoping and envisioning that job interview going, that date going when you finally came to church for the first time, how you envisioned it being, right? That's all our imagination, right? When you're on a long shift and you just can't wait to get off, like what you're picturing the end of that shift like, that's your imagination, right? There's days where it's a long day, the kids are being wild, and I'm envisioning the most chill evening. I text Sarah, tonight we're watching Gilmore Girls, we're getting a pizza. It's going to be the most relaxed night ever, right? It's my imagination, right? Imagination is our capacity to conceive of what could be. Our imagination is our capacity to conceive of what could be. It's what makes humans unique. It's one of the things of what it means to be made in the image of God, to have that capacity, right? Oftentimes, when reality aligns with what we imagined, we're happy about it, right? Like how we wanted something to play out, when that's how it plays out, we're like, yes. But when what we imagined isn't what plays out, we can end up being frustrated or disenfranchised, right? That it's from our imagination that we create ideas about how our life could be better, ideas about how to solve maybe relational problems, maybe ideas about God, right? There is so much power behind an idea. Dallas Willard says this: when Satan undertook to draw Eve away from God, he did not hit her with a stick, but with an idea. It was the idea that God could not be trusted and that she must act on her own to secure her own well-being. That there's so much power behind ideas, and these have their origin in our imagination. All right, you still with me? Last thing is this, for the sake of these 4, is our subconscious. Now, I grew in my knowledge of basketball, paid attention to basketball stuff. We kind of have these daydreams, imaginations on what could be. But in the midst of it all, I thought that I was because I paid so much attention to basketball, was growing in my affections for basketball. I thought, maybe I'm getting better at basketball. Last time I played basketball, wasn't very good. I kept accidentally poking my friend in the eye and doing nothing, getting tired real fast. But I now was a new man who paid attention to a lot of basketball. So subconsciously, not intentionally, but just subconsciously, without any effort of my own, I was like, I'm probably getting pretty good at basketball. So one day I played basketball with some friends, and you guessed it, still terrible, still real bad at basketball, right? But subconsciously, I created this reality without even thinking about it that I was going to be good, right? That our subconscious is the patterns, processes that come from our mind that we don't even think about. They just happen. The subconscious refers to parts of the mind that operate below conscious awareness, but still influence thoughts, feelings, behaviors. It stores memories, habits, instincts, and automatic processes, shaping actions and reactions without active thought. I think that's fascinating. For example, when you automatically tie your shoe or recall a childhood memory unexpectedly, your subconscious is at work. Now, for the sake of today, before we jump in, I just want to make kind of an important distinction that's important for us as we think about this. Romans 12 says this, and we've looked at this passage recently, but it's so important for as we talk about the mind. Paul writes, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, which he, for the last 12 chapters, has talked about the mercy of God, the story of the gospel. He says to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Don't conform to the patterns of the world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. When it comes to our minds, you may be here and you may be like, we'll see if anything sticks, see if anything has anything good to say. I'm probably just going to do what I'm going to do and just carry on with my life. Here's the thing. If you're a follower of Jesus, you have one of two options. Either conform to the patterns of the world or be transformed by the renewing of Jesus. There's no middle ground. There's no hanging out. There's no just floating in the water, right? Our two options are either to let the law of the jungle, the patterns of this world, shape our mind and thus shape us, or to allow the reality of the gospel, the goodness of Jesus, and the work of his Spirit to change us to become more like Christ. There is no in between, right? Our attention, our imagination, our subconscious thoughts are either being conformed to the world or transformed to Christ. Now what I want to do is take all of that, imagination, subconscious, all this stuff, and say, what does it mean? What does it mean to love Jesus with all of our minds? Because you probably didn't walk in today thinking, man, what does it mean to love Jesus with my attention or with my imagination, with my ideas? What does it mean to love him with all those things? And so what I want to do is kind of take that and run it through the scriptural grid. You guys with me? First thing for the sake of today, that we love Jesus with all of our minds when we discipline our minds. When we discipline our minds. I kept stumbling upon this quote that says, the undirected mind tends towards chaos. You know that's true, right? The undirected mind tends towards chaos. Now you think about discipline. We discipline our kids for their well-being, right? We discipline our spending habits to avoid debt. We discipline our eating habits to maintain physical health. But oftentimes when it comes to our thoughts, we don't have any disciplinary measures in place, right? Maybe it's because people can't see our thoughts. Maybe it's because we feel like it's just our own little private world inside our head. But oftentimes we follow the flow of our thoughts wherever they may lead us, right? Because it's just in our own brains. It's not the real world. It's just something that I'm thinking, right? And that's a lie that we would believe, right? That's a lie that we would believe. There is this protective aspect to discipline. There's this protective aspect. I want to look at this. Look at 2 Corinthians 10. Paul kind of uses some strong language. He says, the weapons we fight with are not the weapons of the world. On the contrary, they have divine power to demolish strongholds. We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God. And we take captive every thought and make it obedient to Christ. We take every thought captive and make it obedient to Christ. A years-long affair, a financial scandal, a deep addiction, any of these large things we often don't realize can begin with one thought that leads to one action, right? And what Paul is saying is that every small thought matters. Even if no one else can see it, even if you think it doesn't make a difference. Because what? We're either conforming to the patterns of this world or we are being renewed by the transforming of our minds. That every thought matters. Too often we believe the lie that just that one quick look or 10 seconds of an entertaining thought or a harmless idea or a quick Google won't have a lasting impact. But it's wrong, right? Because our thoughts, even though they might just be in our own head, they're leading us either down a path of anxiety, a path of self-obsession, a path of lustful fantasy, a path of anger and frustration, whatever it may be. And too often we open our minds to whatever floats in. Instead of directing our thoughts, we allow our thoughts to direct us, right? We let voices on TV, algorithms on TikTok, lustful fantasies, opinionated rantings. Sometimes it's some life that we long for because we're dissatisfied with our own, that we take these thoughts and we let them lead us down certain roads. And these thoughts aren't just neutral, but they are changing us, right? And what Paul says thousands of years ago is what modern neuroscience tells us now, is that we can train our brains by taking our thoughts captive. Neuroplasticity is a fancy medical term used to describe your brain's ability to learn and adapt. Think of it as an internal rewiring process that allows your mind to grow and meet new and increased demands. That we can change our brains, right? Too often we say, I'm just slaves to wherever my mind goes, and that's where it leads me. Yet neuroplasticity is this idea that our minds can change, right? When I was a kid, I used to go out in the woods, and the first time you got in the woods, it'd be hard getting through all the brush and briars to make a path, right? You're having to just, get the burrs stuck to you, beat stuff down with a stick to try to make it down. But when you come back the next day and you made a little bit of a rough path, it was easier, right? And our minds are the same way, right? Called neural pathways, that we can kind of forge these new paths to guide our thoughts. This is what Paul is saying. Take every thought captive and make it obedient to Christ. That there's this protective element as we look at our minds, but there's also this proactive element to disciplining our minds. Are you still with me? Second thing is this, that we discipline our minds. Second thing is that we direct our thoughts. Direct our thoughts. Philippians 4 says this. You may be familiar with this passage. We've done a whole series on this passage, but it says this. Don't be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds. Kind of see those together. Guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, noble, right, pure, lovely, admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. Now Love Sarah Fertile has a way to remember all these. It's TNRPLA. TNRPLA is, a little acronym to remember all of these things. So there you go. That's for free from Sarah. I want you to think about this. Focusing on these things is not just a ripcord we pull when a negative thought comes our way, but it's a proactive way of life that chooses daily to fill ourselves with the truth of Jesus. If you think about if the last thing at night that you do is look at your social feed, and if you wake up and you pull the news open right away and you go to work and participating in negative conversations and complaining, don't be surprised when you're like, I just feel like my mind's a bit all over the place, right? Like, just don't be surprised, right? Because you think about, what does it mean to fall asleep for the presence of God, to fall asleep in prayer? We need to do that more often. Fall asleep in prayer at the Lord at nighttime, right? Wake up and acknowledge his presence. Feel ourselves. Psalm 16 says, I have set the Lord always before me. Because he's at my right hand, I shall not be shaken. What does it look like to instill these patterns so that peace might be sown in my life? Now, whether you're driving home today with someone, your family, your friend, on the phone, or in a small group this week, I would encourage you to have this conversation. Because you read that passage from Philippians, you're like, that sounds nice. My grandma said that before. Think about what's true and noble and right? And it feels kind of like this abstract reality. I would encourage you to put some skin on that. What does it mean in your life to focus on what is true and noble and lovely and beautiful and admirable and excellent and praiseworthy? What does that actually mean? Take it from being just a Bible verse that doesn't have bearing in your life to a reality in your life. What does that mean? That verse, first and foremost, is pointing towards Jesus. Jesus is the only one who is truly right, noble, admirable, praiseworthy, excellent, and true, right? But what does it mean to let the blessings of Christ, the reality of Christ, be where our mind goes? Maybe it's particular passages. Maybe it's authors that have a way of speaking to your soul. Maybe it's relationships in your life that's encouraging. Maybe it's memories of how God has worked. Maybe it's stories of his faithfulness. Maybe it's the promises that he's given you. Whatever it is, what does it look like to dwell upon those things? Make it tangible. Make it tangible, or else it just remains this abstract idea. Now, please hear me say this today. This is important. There's probably a lot of self-help books that are really helpful about thinking positively, conquering the day, becoming the best you, all that stuff. That's fine. Whatever. That's not what Paul's talking about. Paul's not talking about the power of positive thinking. If you just have good thoughts, you'll become good. That's not what he's talking about. What he's talking about is fixing your mind on Christ, so that our inner mind might be transformed to the image of Christ. That's what he's talking about. You're like, well, Aiden, what's the difference? Here's the difference. You can read Power of Positive Thinking. You can think positive thoughts, become a positive person, and it have nothing to do with Jesus. You know that, right? You can be positive. You can conquer the day. You can slam tomorrow. It's going to be great, but it can have nothing to do with Jesus. And I, for one, would rather wrestle with Christ than have some perfect mind apart from Jesus. Because Paul's like, man, I've been shipwrecked, I've been beaten, I've been torn down, but he says to live is Christ and to die is gain. Like, I'd rather have that, right? John Stott, an old English theologian, says neither positive thinking or positive mental attitudes is the same thing as Christian faith. Faith is not optimism. Doesn't mean it's not part of it. But just don't get the two confused. We're not talking about power positive thinking today. We're talking about centering our minds given by God on Jesus Christ. All right, still with me. I want to walk through this for a second because I think there's power here. If you get lost, we'll get back on the trail here in a minute. All right, 2 Corinthians 3. Paul says this. He's painting this picture. He's painting this, kind of using this reference to the Old Testament, where Moses went up and got the law, the tablets of stone. It comes down from the mountain of being with God, and his face is radiant with the glory of God, where people can't look upon Moses because his face is radiating with God's glory, so he has to veil his face, right? And now Paul's kind of riffing on that. He says in chapter 3, verse 17, excuse me, now the Lord is Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. And we all who with unveiled faces, and I'd underline this, contemplate the Lord's glory. We're being transformed into his image with ever-increasing glory, which comes from the Lord. Let's say it this way. You become what you behold, or you become what you're in awe of. Now, it's a worthwhile question. What does that feels a little bit like weird Bible language. What does it mean to contemplate the Lord's glory, that we might be transformed into his image? That word can mean that contemplate, think on, reflect on, behold his glory, kind of turn it over in our minds. What does that practically mean to contemplate the Lord's glory, to think on his goodness, to think on his glory, that we might be transformed? I think it means a couple things. I think it means that we should be in awe by the magnitude of creation. Psalm 19 says the heavens declare the glory of God. From the face of a baby to the setting of the sun, that we see the glory of God in creation, right? From a beautiful crisp day in the summer to a white day like today, that we see the glory of God, right? And that we should be in awe at the magnitude of his creation. But more so, I think this. I like it. More so this, that we should be comforted by the reality of the incarnation. That we should be comforted by the reality that God became one of us. In the book of John, it says, the Word became flesh, made his dwelling among us, and we have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. That we see God's glory when God became one of us. That we see God's glory when he took on flesh and became a human. And we should be comforted by that reality, that we contemplate his glory when we are comforted by the reality of the incarnation. Because you know what is true? Jesus, as a man, wrestled in his mind with the presence of the evil one, with Satan. We see that in John 4, right? When he was tempted by the evil one, we see this battle for his mind, right? That we see in the Garden of Gethsemane. We see Jesus in his mind wrestling, struggling with what the Father had called him to do, that we should have comfort in the incarnation, right? When we see God's glory. Now, knowing these things is important. It's so important that we know these things, right? Knowing the power of the cross, knowing the power of the incarnation, knowing these things is of utmost importance, but contemplating them, turning them over in our minds, meditating on the reality of it all is so important. Too often we can fly through our lives and we can fly through our belief and love of Jesus. Can I just ask you this question? Don't answer out loud. It's always weird when we do that. Why do you love Jesus? Why are you captured by the story? How has it changed your life? If you can't think of answers, you may be long overdue to sit, walk, pray, reflect, contemplate on the glory and the goodness of the Lord. You know, when you hear like a perfect record, You go to an art museum and see some art, or you see a sunset. You don't ask the question, so what should I do here? You just take it in, right? You just behold it. You contemplate it. You reflect on it. You let it change you. And I would encourage you that our minds, that we direct our thoughts, when we fix our eyes on what's true, and when we contemplate the Lord's glory, that we will be transformed into his likeness. All right, you still with me? Third thing is this, that we discipline our minds, direct our thoughts, and we live from a gospel disposition, live from a gospel mindset. Philippians 2, perhaps the most beautiful passages in all of Scripture. It says this, in your relationships with one another, like that's the context by which Paul's having this conversation. In your relationships, have the same what? The same mindset as Christ Jesus. What was his mindset? Who being in the very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking on the very nature of a servant. Being made in human likeness, being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. So Paul is saying, he says, have the same mindset as Jesus in your relationships. In your marriage relationships, in the relationships that frustrate you, in the relationships with your children, in the relationships with your annoying coworkers, in the relationships with the weird person in your grace group. If you don't have one, might be you, right? In your relationships with all of your friends. In your relationships with these people, have the same mindset, the same disposition that Jesus had. And what was his disposition? That even though he was God, he didn't say, this is what I should get, this is how things should go. Even though he was God, he humbled himself for the sake of others. That's the mindset that we are called to have. And my friends, that if you're just floating around as conforming to the patterns of the world, not going to lead you there. But that is the power of God, the Spirit of God transforming your mind as we make it obedient to Christ, right? That is living from a gospel disposition, having the same mindset as Jesus. Paul isn't encouraging us just to have knowledge of Christ, but by directing and disciplining our minds, we are living from a disposition of Christ likeness. And this changes our attitude, our worldview, our perspective. It clothes us in humility, changes the way we see ourselves and everything around us. It's not just simply positive thinking, but it's upending everything that we think. It's what it means to be transformed by the renewing of our minds. Now, easier said than done, right? Easier said than done. I want to look at this, and then we'll ask some questions and sing a song. In Matthew 16, Jesus is with his disciples. It says, from that time, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem, suffer many things, the elders and chief priests and the scribes, and be killed, and on the third day raised. Jesus is with his disciples, and he's like, this is what's about to go down, right? Just tell them everything. And Peter took him aside. Many of us have heard this story. He took Jesus aside and began to rebuke Jesus. Jesus, what are you talking about? Keep it down, man. You can't die. This shall never happen to you. But Jesus turned and said to Peter, get behind me, Satan. Never good when Jesus calls you Satan. He says, you are a hindrance to me. Now, many of you, maybe if you've been around here for any amount of time, you've heard this story, right? You've heard us kind of read this passage. But look at what Jesus says. For you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man. You do not have a gospel mindset. You don't have a mindset that's focused on my mind. That, Peter, you are conforming to the patterns of the world, because the patterns of the world oftentimes probably make more sense. Of course it makes more sense. No, Jesus, you're not going to die. We'll take over before that happens. That makes more sense, right? But Jesus will slowly, through Peter's failings, renew his mind, right? And you see a whole new Peter in the book of Acts. But what happens here is that Peter was conforming to the patterns of the world because human logic couldn't make sense of victory through death. And as much as sometimes we need to proactively discipline our minds, direct our thoughts, there are times, and we see this right here, there are times where we just simply need to change our minds to agree with God. There are times where we are just in the wrong, and I need to change my mind to agree with God. This is, we said this last week, this is what the word repent means. It means metanoia. That word means to change your mind. That's what repenting is. It's changing your mind about how you thought about things and aligning it with what God says, what God invites us into. That we must live with a gospel mindset, a gospel disposition. All right. I'm going to invite the team out. We're going to close with a song just to kind of spend some time just kind of reflecting on where God may have your mind today. But I just want to ask you a couple questions if that's cool. Is that all right? First thing is this. I want to ask you this. What are you paying attention to? What are you paying attention to? Where's your attention going? Yourself, your social feeds, maybe fears, maybe voices. I don't know if you've thought about this, but we have a God who first paid attention to us, who is preoccupied with us. I don't know if you've ever thought about that. God is not indifferent towards you, but God is paying attention to you. He is attentive to you. And what does it mean to pay attention to the God who is paying attention to us? Because to quote Leighton Ford from earlier, paying attention is a way to see what has already been given to us. And too often the blessings of the gospel, they don't land in our hearts. Not simply because we're obstinate to it, not simply because we're rejecting it, but sometimes we're just not paying attention. We're not looking, we're not listening. That's why Jesus says, whoever has ears, let him hear. Whoever has eyes, let him see. Pay attention. And maybe for you this week, maybe prayer is less about just reading through a laundry list. Not that that's bad, but that can be where we always default. And maybe part of prayer this week is being attentive to who God is, and to what he's doing, and to what his word says, and what he wants to do through you, and simply paying attention. I think as we pay attention, we might just start to see opportunities that we didn't see before. We might start to see people that we didn't see before. We might begin to see realities in our lives that we didn't see before because we're paying attention to the presence of God. Second question is this. Are you allowing him to captivate your mind? Are you allowing Jesus to captivate your mind, letting him shape your imagination, filling yourself with the knowledge of his character, his word, his invitation? Too often there's this false dichotomy that you're like, yeah, I've got like some like nerdy theology friends. They love all that stuff. I'm more of like a heart person. So I'm more like I love worship, but not like, the Bible. It's a false dichotomy, right? That we're called to worship Jesus in spirit and in truth. And I would encourage you in this. If you're someone who feels overwhelmed by theology, or sometimes you start to get in the Bible, names start to get weird, and you're like, I don't know what's going on. Like, I would encourage you, just a small step at a time, to pursue knowledge of God, to pursue knowledge of the scriptures. We live in a day and age where there are so many amazing tools at our fingertips. I would encourage you the ESV Study Bible hardback. That bad boy's always on clearance somewhere. Just go on Amazon. I bet it's $15. So much knowledge and wisdom and insight in that. BibleProject.com. We've got more at our fingertips than the church had almost all throughout history, right? And here's the thing. It's not about just learning for the sake of learning. R.C. Sproul says this: true knowledge of God always bears fruit in greater love for God and greater desire to praise him. That the hope as we grow in knowledge and understanding of God is that we might see Jesus all the clearer. That as we study the scriptures, we might see, oh man, what Jesus did there was fulfilling this. Oh, the gospel is longer than I realized. Oh, when Jesus loved this person, they had this struggle and it was actually displaying this. Oh man, the gospel's wider than I even could comprehend. Like letting knowledge stir our hearts to worship. But don't settle for kind of outsourcing knowledge for other people. Grow. Let the goodness of Jesus captivate your mind. And the last thing is just simply this. What does it look like to glorify God with the mind that he gave you? What does it look like to glorify God with the mind that he gave you? If you are a creative, create. If you've been gifted with skill in numbers or leading or management, use that to the glory of God. If you are a deep thinker, If you have deep questions about God and faith and theology, bring the depth of your wanderings before him. Because your mind is not just some survival technique that evolved over millennia, but your mind is a reflection of the God who created it. You were created in the image of God. Your intellect, your knowledge, your mind is a reflection of the God who has created us. What does it mean to glorify God with that mind that he's given you? We're just going to sing a song together. Would you stand? I just want to pray a prayer from an old saint. It says this. Holy Father, full of grace, give us wisdom to perceive you, intelligence to fathom you, patience to wait for you, eyes to behold you, a heart to meditate upon you, and a life to proclaim you. Through the power of the Spirit of Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.